About I do have a short story. I do have a short story that's out in a collection. It's called Stories, that I could read and that reads pretty well. This is got a pretty new story in it. It actually has a story. There's another writer here, Kat Howard, who's in the back, who also has a story in this collection. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it. So, but the thing about reading from this is. The story does take a while. It would take me almost a half an hour to read, 20. I've read it a couple times before. And I think that probably most of you are here to talk about the comic because you're interested in the comic. So maybe I shouldn't go there. But I have to read something. And Kat says I'm not allowed to read something from a book that's not by me. But I disagree. So I am going to read, and I have a point to it. So I'm going to read something from a book by a guy named Dennis Johnson. This is called Jesus' Son, and I'll go ahead and make a point. This is a scene from a story called Emergency. These two stoners are driving in a car. So I just pick it up. A jackrabbit scurried out in front of us and we hit it. What was that? A rabbit. Something thumped. You hit him, he thumped. Georgie stood on the brake pedal. Rabbits do. He threw the truck in reverse and zigzagged back toward the rabbit. Where's my hunting knife? He almost ran over the poor animal a second time. We'll camp in the wilderness, he said. In the morning, we'll breakfast on its haunches. He was waving his hunting knife around in what I was sure was a dangerous way. In a minute, he was standing at the edge of the fields, cutting the scrawny little thing up, tossing away its organs. I should have been a doctor, he cried. A family in a big Dodge, the only car we'd seen for a long time, slowed down and gawked out the windows as they passed by. The father said, What is it? A snake? No, it's not a snake, Georgie said. It's a rabbit with babies inside it. Babies? The mother said, and the father sped the car forward over the protests of several little kids in the back. Georgie came back to my side of the truck with his shirt front stretched out in front of him as if he were carrying apples in it or some such, but they were, in fact, slimy miniature bunnies. No way I'm eating those things, I told him. Take them. I gotta drive. Take them, he said, dumping them in my lap and getting in on his side of the truck. He started driving along faster and faster with a look of glory on his face. We killed the mother and saved the children, he said. It's getting late, I said. Let's get back to town. You bet. 60, 70, 85, just topping 90. These rabbits better be kept warm. One at a time, I slid the little things in between my shirt buttons and nestled them against my belly. They're hardly moving, I told Georgie. We'll get some milk and sugar and all that, and we'll raise them up ourselves. They'll get as big as Corellas. I actually listened to this on audio earlier today, and I was moaning in the car at the thought of someone stuffing slippery, slimy bunny embryos down their shirt, and I was wishing I had written that scene. And I think that's really what I'm hoping for whenever I write anything, whether it's a short story, a book, or a comic book. I'm always hoping I'll write something that will cause the reader to recoil in revulsion and drop the book moaning in horror. I don't think I've been lucky enough to pull that off many times, but if I've ever gotten even close, I feel like I've accomplished something worthwhile. Let me talk about where the comic book came from, and then if you guys had some questions, maybe we could just have a conversation. The comic book is the result of a long series of hard-fought failures. I spent about 3 years writing this book, this novel, this epic fantasy novel that I felt sure was going to be the masterpiece that would make my career. It was supposed to be sort of like if John Irving had tried to write The Hobbit. And the thing sprawled. It was 900 pages long. And I worked on it. I worked on it for 3 years, and finally I sent it out, and it was turned down by every publisher in America, big and small, and it was turned down by every publisher in England, and for an extra kick in the pants, it was turned down by a few publishers in Canada. And after 18 solid months of rejection, it suddenly hit me that it wasn't ever going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. It wasn't even going to be in bookstores because I had written a bad novel. And I hastily wrote another novel immediately afterwards, which was even worse. It was a book called The Briars, and it only had a few elements that were kind of interesting. The Briars was a book about a young, brilliant, but deranged sociopath, a kid of about 16, very intelligent, very emotionally disassociated, and he spends a summer at a New England house with a lot of houses, old houses in New England have names. This house is called The Briars. And this kid, whose name was Sam Lesser, spends the summer at this house, and his friend comes up to visit him, a thug named Al Grubb, and they hang out for some of this summer, and then one day they decide it would be fun to go on a killing spree, and wind up over the next 2 or 3 days killing dozens of people. Well, I think they wound up killing just under a dozen people in the name of they feel that they're sacrificing these people to a god that they have kind of invented named Dodge, and some of the elements of the book were good, but it was a very incoherent, frightened piece, and I gave it up midway through the second draft, and I had been knocking around for a while. I had written these 2 novels. I had also written some short stories. And I had always believed that I was going to be a novelist, that was going to be my career. But after the epic fantasy novel and The Briars failed to come to fruition, I began to feel that maybe it wasn't really in the cards for me. And that maybe that would be okay. At the same time that I had written these failed novels, I had written some successful short stories. A few of them had really seemed alive and exciting. They had not been read by many people. They had been published in small journals. But a few had been nominated for prizes, and one had wound up in a best-of collection. And I felt like, well, maybe I don't get to have a career as a novelist. Maybe I'll do something else. But I have my short stories, and that's pretty good. And I took pride in the feeling that I could compose a 20 or 30-page story that people would find entertaining. One of these stories, 20th Century Ghost, had wound up in a best-of collection, and a talent scout at Marvel Comics came across it and got in touch with me and asked if I had ever had any interest in writing about guys in spandex punching each other. And it just so happened that, in fact, I spent most of my youth obsessed with guys in spandex punching each other. Most of my favorite writers as I was growing up didn't write prose fiction, they wrote comic books. They were guys like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore, and even some of the prose writers I enjoyed, I first discovered through comic books. I revered Ray Bradbury, but I first discovered Ray Bradbury not through his short stories or his novels, but through comic book adaptations of his short stories that had wound up in the Tales from the Crypt comics. So I got very excited, and I said, yeah, hell yeah, I'd love to write a superhero story. Because I also felt, okay, I don't know how to write a novel, but I do know how to write a short story. And I've got that, and now I'd like to have readers. And it was my feeling that I could write a short story for the High Plains Literary Review that would only be read by 200 people. But if I stuck Spider-Man in the same story, I could sell it to Marvel Comics and it would be read by 12,000 people, or maybe 20,000 people. And I kind of liked the idea of having all those readers. So I wound up doing an 11-page story about Spider-Man that has to be the absolute worst published piece of work I've ever done. It was a disastrous failure, and it's inexplicable to me that they decided to publish it, except I think they had to fill those 11 pages. They had assumed they would get something good, and by the time they realized they had something that was no good, it was too late to back out. And the story was saved somewhat by the art of a very gifted young artist named Seth Fisher. In spite of my obvious incompetence at writing comics, Seth Fisher seemed to take a shine to me. And he stayed in touch with me and began to encourage me to write more comic scripts, and even sort of hinted that he would be willing to draw some of these for independent comics. And even though I had failed miserably, I kind of had this bug in me to do more. So I wrote some other 11-page scripts that were done for a little horror comic that never really saw the light of day. And I thought about the form, and I started reading a comic a day. And then around the same time, my first book of short stories came out. And after the book of stories came out, IDW Comics came to me and said, do you have any interest in doing some adaptations of these stories for comics? And by then I had worked up a pitch for a continuing series, and I said, no, let's instead of just taking some of my short stories and doing comic book versions of them, let's do something original. And they gave me a chance to do Locke and Key. And for those of you who have read it, the failed novel that I described, The Briars, became essentially the first issue of the comic. Everything that was good in the book, it's like I dumped it into a sifter and just shook back and forth until I had the few good parts. And then I took those good parts and lumped them together with a new idea, and that became the first issue. And my plan was that the comic would run about 12 issues. We're up to issue 22 now, I think, with about 15 more to go. So I was a little bit wrong about how much I had left to write. But that's where we are, and it's been a lot of fun. It's been a great time. I always, like I say, I grew up reading guys like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. A lot of my current favorite writers are guys like Brian K. Vaughan and Ed Brubaker, and I always wanted to have a series, some characters that I could return to for recurring adventures. So that's been a real blast for me. We're halfway through. We've got 3 more books to go, and then the thing will wrap up. And I guess that's about what I would have to say about the comic, at least to open. Do you guys want to ask some questions about it?